If you study British history, you will at some point hear about Richard III. He is infamous as a maniacal hunchbacked king, plotting the downfall of all who stood in the way of the crown. In his play, Shakespeare painted him as bitter over the stigma attached to his physical deformity, which sparked malicious action toward all around him. History has promoted this view. But who was he, really? He was born on October 2nd, 1452, to Richard, Duke of York, and his wife, Cecily Neville. In 1460, his father, the Duke of York, made a deal with Henry VI, who agreed to pass the kingship on to him. Unfortunately, the Duke of York died later that year, in the Battle of Wakefield during the first spat of the War of Roses. The War of Roses was a power struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster for the throne of England. After this, Richard's oldest brother Edward defeated the Lancastrians and was declared king in 1461. He made Richard his lieutenant of the north. In 1483, Edward IV died of unknown causes. His 12-year-old son, another Edward, succeeded him. Richard was made Lord Protector for the young king. However, when the legitimacy of Edward V's birth was questioned, he was deposed, and Richard was made king. The now King Richard III imprisoned Edward and Edward's younger brother, also Richard, in the Tower of London. They later disappeared, and common thought, perpetrated by Shakespeare, was that Richard had murdered them out of bitterness. Aside from that, Richard III actually did several beneficial things for England during his reign. In 1484, he had the parliamentary statutes written down and printed for the first time in history. He agreed to a ceasefire with the Scottish government, and he allowed Henry VI's remains to be relocated to St. George's Chapel, a motion of peace to his Lancastrian enemies. Despite this, in 1485, Henry Tudor raised a Lancastrian army aiming to overthrow Richard. Richard responded in kind, and the armies engaged at Bosworth. During the climax of the battle, Richard was killed. His body was buried unceremoniously at the Grey Friars Church in Leicestershire, underneath the floor. Years passed, and in September 2012, archaeologists studying the former cemetery of the Grey Friars Chapel, now a parking lot, discovered a skeleton they believed could be Richard III's. After DNA testing, it was confirmed in February of 2013 that the skeleton was indeed the long-lost King Richard III. This revelation brought several facts to light, altering the historical perception of the king. It was found that he suffered from a spinal disorder known as idiopathic scoliosis, a sideways curvature in the spine which results in uneven shoulders or hips, the cause of which is unknown. This contradicted the notion that he was a hunchback or suffered from kyphosis, a forward curvature of the spine that causes the upper part of the back to appear more rounded than normal. While his scoliosis is classed as severe, the curve was well balanced, which means that the physical disfigurement was slight and could be easily disguised with custom-made clothing. Because his disorder was mostly unobvious, the stigma historians have said his Piers-Held sourcing most likely did not exist. This explains why his contemporaries never described him as antisocial or bitter, a fact that historians working from the previous perspective were puzzled by. In this light, it is harder to pin the deaths of his young nephews on him. It is likely that the picture of a manic, self-seeking hunchback grew up after his defeat at Bosworth. Henry Tudor, stripping his armor once he was dead and seeing his defect for the first time, probably broadcast that picture throughout England in hopes of justifying his usurpation of the crown. Shakespeare, hoping to impress Henry's granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth I, further added to the myth with his renowned play. After all, winners always write history. So an accurate picture of Richard III is not as a hunchbacked schemer, but that of an able-bodied and psychologically stable young man who wasn't any more feared or hated than any other ruler of his time. Now excuse me while I go dig up Shakespeare and make him rewrite his play. If you study British history, you will at some point hear about Richard III.